President Trump has declared the ceasefire over. Is the memo of understanding, as you see it now, dead as well?
I hope so. I hope so. Look, first of all, I don't think the ceasefire was ever in place. I've been describing it more as a suspension of major hostilities because we were having every few days these tit-for-tat strikes, right? So that said, he's hinted at, but I'd like to hear him explicitly say the MOU is done, because of the 14 points, only one addressed the nuclear issue, and even that had just a subtle reference to the disposition of enriched material, which I thought favored Iran. But the other 13 points, if you take out the administrative ones, it was much more about, you know, how we were going to, the reconstruction fund for Iran, we were going to free up assets, we were going to renew the licenses, much how we were going to pull U.S. troops back out of the region, which to me was in there, and nobody's really addressed what that meant. And so I had a lot of concerns about what was in the black letter language of the deal. And so I'd like to see him start over and kind of come up with something, craft something maybe more narrow that gets us through the first phase regarding a real ceasefire and the status of the strait. And then we'll figure out the nuclear stuff later.
Play that out for me, what that looks like. So here we are, where we've had this back and forth with Iran while the 60-day period has been in place. We're just going to bide time and try to figure it out again. What's your counsel to those who are trying to hammer out some kind of an agreement?
Well, the two things that have been disrupting the ceasefire, I'll play along with that word, has been Lebanon and has been the control of the strait or passage of the strait, right? So it's been relatively quiet out of Lebanon, although there's still strikes going on back and forth. But clearly what's at hand now is the Iranians want to claim and have claimed control of the strait, sovereignty over it. And if you look at paragraph 5 of the MOU, it suggests and all but states that we acknowledge that in the MOU, because it says after 30 days they'll work with Oman and others regarding the future administration of the strait. So I think in their view, in Tehran's view, we've exceeded that. And of course, in our view, we have not. And in my view is we need to get back to the negotiation table, focus first on at least that. And in the meantime, let's keep strangling. Let's keep our hands around their economic throat, bring back the blockade. I said this before the president did. Secondly, of course, no more licenses, no more release of funds, things like that. But also don't block the strait. We got to block their ground routes coming in, block the air routes coming in, and make sure we put as much pressure on the regime as possible. Now, I know that means hardship for the Iranian people, but it's also going to mean eventually hardship for the regime. It's going to inhibit their ability to supply their proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and others. It's going to inhibit their ability to rebuild their ballistic missile stock, so forth and so on. But to me, that has the highest return on investment with the lowest risk, because otherwise, you know, you start talking about boots on the ground, and nobody wants to go there. I don't want to go there, and I think it's a very risky proposition. So that's how I would play it out. The problem is it's a long strategy. It takes patience, it takes discipline, and then we got to see who can withstand those economic sanctions longest.
Practical question just about that blockade. So as you and I are talking, it's back in effect. Right. How long can we sustain that? Can it go on in perpetuity? How long would you like to see it in place?
I'd like to see it in place long enough to bring the Iranians seriously back to the negotiation table to discuss the way forward on the assumption, or on the clear, actually on the explicit acknowledgement that the strait will remain free and open for commerce. No control, no management, no fees, no nothing. So I think we can withstand that longer than they can. Now, what it's going to mean for the American people is higher prices at the pump, and for the president, it's going to mean political, heat, right? Dissatisfaction with his policy. But I think in terms of the long game, I think it's the smart play. And look, we're a net energy exporter. I think we can survive. It's going to put more pressure on our allies and partners, clearly. But I'd also like to see this globalized. This is too much about Iran versus the United States. It should be the democracies of the world, the countries of the world that subscribe to freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas, should be there at this point supporting us in whatever way possible.
Do you see that happening? I go back to the NATO summit that took place a few days ago. Mark Rutte, Secretary General, seemed to leave the door open for that. I mean, the president's dissatisfaction with the fact that allies haven't come to help was pretty palpable. Do you think that NATO allies are likely to come around to the idea that they need to help?
Yes, I'm going to pick at the word NATO because I don't think it's a NATO issue at all. So what I say is our European allies should be on board with us, and our Canadian allies, and our Australian and New Zealand. We kind of go around the globe. Every democracy, whether it's north, south, east, or west, should be on board supporting the opening of the strait, the defending the principle of freedom of navigation and freedom of the seas, and we're just not really seeing that right now. I know we got into this without consulting them. I know that rubs them wrong, but here we are 5 months into it. Let's step back, let's look at the bigger picture and see what's at stake at this point in time. We're talking about the Strait, but we got to remember we're still dealing with an Iran that wants to pursue nuclear weapons, threaten others, and of course has proxies throughout the region.
Question about strategic clarity. So over the last 24 hours, initially it was President Trump would impose this 20% toll on ships in exchange for protection, took that off, talked about kind of investment from Gulf nations. Is it useful to have that at that moment? Do you have a good sense of his sense of strategic clarity?
Look, I think that's frustration revealing itself, but he said that before, and it ultimately comes back to where it makes sense, and that is defending the freedom of navigation, the freedom of commerce. And Secretary of State Rubio said it, J.D. Vance, I mean, many members of his cabinet have defended that principle. So he's coming back to that, and I think we'll defend that principle. But I think, like I said, I think he thought he had to deal with the Iranians and now believes they've broken it, and there's frustration. That's understandable.
Let's talk a bit about Europe, and something that came out of that NATO summit was the President's willingness to give a Patriot's license to Ukraine. How do you see that playing out in actual fact? I know there's been some concern here, why build a factory that could do that in Ukraine if it would be a target to the Russians?
Sure.
How do you do it, and how do you do it so it's useful for them right now?
Well, look, I think first and foremost that was an important signal coming out of the summit. Also, his engagement with Zelensky was far better than it's been in the past. So it was an important signal. But in terms of a material difference now, it's not going to make it because, look, I work for a major defense industrial, and I understand the Patriot MSC missiles. I know how long it takes to stand up a line, to train workers, to build your supply chains. We also have the practical experience, for example, of Germany, who I think got permission to build Patriots in 2022 and have yet to build one.
Still at it.
So right. I think the signal was very important. I think it expressed a confidence from the president in terms of Zelensky and Ukraine. But seeing missiles coming off the line anytime soon is going to be out there. So I think there's going to still be that need for us to up our production output and to make up for that. And then for the European allies to contribute as well, reprioritize the flow of weapons so that he can defend against ballistic missiles, which he cannot do right now.
NATO summits are, as you know, very short, just a day and a half, but there was this evolution in President Trump's rhetoric over the course of that day and a half. As you say, he did kind of come around to talking up Ukraine. It was a positive meeting with President Zelensky. What do you attribute that to?
Well, look, you're right. He came in with a lot of grievances about
familiar ones.
Yeah, but justified ones as well in some cases. So I've been saying from my time in office, my first appearance at NATO, when I was nominated but not yet confirmed, I stood up there and I said in Brussels, look, I served in NATO. I was a soldier based in Europe. I'm a strong believer in the alliance, but they have to live up to their obligations. At that point in time, it was 2%, and only 7 or 8 countries were meeting that. And here we are, 6, 7 years later. The bar has been moved to 5%. Most allies have done that. Some of them have said, yeah, 5%, but by the year 2030, whatever. Way too late, and others have flatly refused. So he's right to say that some are still not doing their fair share, and he's highlighted Spain as one. I think others, Greenland, for example, we can agree that just kind of really cuts under to NATO, the core, and what it means, because Greenland, part of Denmark, which is part of NATO. So, but he came out of it in the end. I think he had good discussions, one-on-ones with leaders. I mean, obviously, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has built a good relationship, knows how to manage it well, and I think has done a lot of good in terms of building that rapport and keeping the alliance as unified as it can be in this unique period of time.
A lot of hand-wringing before each of these summits. Is the U.S.'s commitment going to be the same? Is the U.S. going to withdraw from it? Is NATO going to survive? What's your sense of the kind of longevity of NATO on the heels of
My sense is that large majorities of politicians, elected leaders on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, support the alliance. They see the value of it to the United States. They see the importance of it in terms of defending democracies of the world against the autocracies of the world. And in fact, I think a latest poll came out that said a majority of MAGA, self-identified MAGA Republicans support the alliance. And so I think support will be there. I think, again, frankly, there's been, and it's less so now, that our other allies have to recognize the fact that the American people, not just this administration, but the American people, are tired of carrying the burden mostly by themselves. And when I talked to the Europeans, I gave this same speech and I said, look, Donald Trump's not saying anything new. President Obama in 2014 at the Wells Summit, I think, when the 2% threshold was met, called them free riders. If you go all the way back, it goes back to Eisenhower, which said the Europeans need to do more. So look, in this day and age, when we have a revanchist Russia, we have a China that has global ambitions, We all have to spend more, put more capabilities out there, and be able to defend, again, not just against Russia, but against the autocracies and their coordinated rise that's happening out there in the world.
Got a couple questions about China, but before I get there, let me just ask you about the U.S.'s attitude toward Europe at this moment in time. So you have the Defense Secretary conducting this review. How many troops should we have in Europe? The general who is in charge of the overseeing Europe and Africa. Do you feel like the U.S. is sort of adequately supporting Europe at this moment? Is that relationship under a kind of revision or rethink at this moment?
Look, I think it's always good to review your troop dispositions and capability dispositions around the globe. I did the same when I came in. With regard to Europe, because I knew the president did not like the presence of so many troops in Germany as a case in point. What I said to my commander at the time is I said, look, I want you to provide me options, but they have to meet a few core principles, right? They have to reassure the allies. They have to maintain operational readiness for the United States. They have to deter Russia. It has to meet certain principles, and then tell me what you came up with. And we came up with a pretty credible plan of moving, I think it was actually 11,000 troops out of Germany, but it wasn't back to the United States. We eventually came forward with a plan that would move them closer to the Russians, so into Poland, into Romania, into Bulgaria. And so I think if you come up with something that looks like that, where it meets certain key principles of preserving readiness, reassuring allies, deterring Russia, et cetera, then I think it's good to have these reviews and take a look at what your footprint looks like. And the world changes as well. I mean, the Chinese continue to build capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, and that may require some changing around as well.
Let me get there, because I think we're gazing eastward, looking at what's happening in Europe, Ukraine, looking at the Middle East. Are we paying enough attention to what's happening in China? And
I don't think so.
What are you most worried about when it comes to that relationship?
It feels to me, and look, every administration only has so much of an attention span, but it seems to me we're looking, for good reasons, right? We're looking east, right? Mm-hmm. We're looking at Europe, and then we're looking south into Iran and the Middle East, and we're focused there. And meanwhile, China is over there continuing to build the largest Navy in the world, building their Air Force, developing advanced cyber and space capabilities. They're bullying their neighbors, right? We know that they're putting a lot of pressure right now on Prime Minister Takaichi in Japan, right? Because of what she said in November, the truth she told about Taiwan back in November. And so I get concerned about those things. And of course, adjacent to that, or in addition to that, we know that we're burning a lot of munitions that we need for that fight over there in Ukraine and against Iran and stuff like that. And again, important theaters to do, but we need to really up our game when it comes to defense production, stockpiling munitions, a new breed of munitions as well when it comes to innovation and things like that. So that's what I'm focused on. You mentioned Taiwan and the president still kind of holding back that arms package. Are you reasonably confident that in the end Taiwan's going to get that package from the U.S.? I think so. My suspicion is he's holding it out because Xi Jinping's going to be coming over in a few months, and maybe that's the reason. But I think it deserves some inquiry, and I think the Taiwanese will probably have some concern. But look, even if we did approve that package, I'll go back to where I was just talking. They have somewhere between $20 and $30 billion of outstanding deliveries that still have not occurred, and we need to get them capabilities now. It can't just be we give them the money for an arms sale, and maybe they'll see that F-16 or that HIMARS or whatever in 10 years from now. I mean, they need it now because what we need to do is deter the Chinese, and particularly Xi Jinping, whose third term expires in 2027. He's 72 years old. We know that he wants to end up in the pantheon of great Chinese leaders alongside Mao. And to do that, he believes that he needs to bring Taiwan back into the fold. So there's only so many years that we got to be very careful of and make sure we can maintain deterrence. And to me, deterrence begins in Taiwan with the Taiwanese building up their capabilities, asymmetric capabilities. Let me end by asking you about Senator Lindsey Graham, who passed away in recent days. And he's somebody who obviously talked a lot about the importance of NATO, talked about Taiwan an awful lot. Can you explain sort of what's lost within the Republican Party, within the U.S. Senate, not having him there any longer? Yeah, he was a big loss, and I'd known Lindsey for 25 years, particularly when I traveled with him and John McCain when I worked for Fred Thompson. Fred was one of the original Amigos. Tennessee, yeah. That's right. So, and Lindsey was very supportive of me when I was Secretary of the Army and Secretary of Defense. So, look, I think what South Carolina has lost, what the Senate has lost, what Congress has lost, what the country has lost, is a Republican on the Hill who deeply believed in the Reagan-esque principles that I believe in with regard to American leadership in the world, American-supported democracies, particularly those under threat. And so that voice is going to be missed, and it's hard to see who's going to step in and fill that void. And more importantly, not just kind of talk about those principles, advance legislation, make the trips, go visit, see what's happening on the ground, but he also had the president's ear. And he had a way of talking to the president to get him on board, whether it was providing an avenue for Ukraine to still get munitions, or to not withdraw, or to support Israel, things like that. So that's the big question for us, for the United States right now, is who's going to be that voice in Congress on the Republican side who can talk to the president about the world around us and the role that America should play globally.
You were in a position where you had to give advice to the president. I imagine you disagreed on some matters along the way. Picking up on what you just said, what was it about Lindsey Graham that made him so effective in that he could push back on the president, they could still get along, have a good relationship? I think it's something that's flummoxed a lot of people who maybe were a little worried about pushing back on him or criticizing him. Graham seemed to know how to do it.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the recipe was. I mean, you try and study those people to figure out what the key is. But I think he was also very good at putting it in terms that the president intuitively understood, which was transactional terms or business-like terms. I remember that when the president was talking, I was in office at the time, about withdrawing U.S. troops from Iraq and Syria, where we had, and Lindsey kind of turned it around to, we have to secure the oil, and it made it about the oil and not about American presence there to fight off ISIS, which was my approach, right? And so he very cleverly was able to walk the president back some, and that was very useful at the time to have his voice weigh in. And I think we've seen it since then in other areas, whether it was, again, Israel or Ukraine and whatnot. And hopefully, if there's any silver lining that comes out of his tragic, a surprise passing, that maybe this bill that is aimed at Russia will move forward finally.